What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this weekend saw one of the largest events of the year for Warhammer 40k, and a big one for the community because it's one of the largest events that we've had since the December update and content drop. This past weekend, we watched the Nottingham 40k Supermajor, an almost 400 player Supermajor go down and generate a ton of results using these new detachments, as well as showcasing some of the new mechanics in use at the absolute bleeding edge of competitive play. What we're going to be doing today is talk about the lists that got to the top cut, what they do, how they were used, and some of the synergies used within them. There are other undefeated lists for this event, however, and we saw more events go down this weekend, which I will be discussing later on this week on the channel. So stay tuned if you want to hear more analysis and discussion about this new Warhammer 40k metagame. Now, first off, a breakdown of the event itself and the format that it used. The Nottingham Supermajor is a UKTC, that's UK Tournament Circuit event, that uses all of the UKTC rules as well as terrain layouts. The event nominally only ran 5 rounds, and for basically 400 players using a Swiss pairing system, 5 rounds is not enough to get to a single undefeated. So in order to get a final winner, 5 normal Swiss rounds were played, where players played against other players with the same number of wins as them until we got down to 12 undefeated. Of those 12, the top 4 in terms of placement, usually based on their battle point score, to then play against each other in a top cut. These top cut games were single elimination, so as soon as one player had lost a game, they were out and out of the running. Now, the entire event was streamed over by the Epic Flail HQ YouTube channel. I'll drop a link in the video description to their channel. Please go check out their coverage of the event if you want to watch all of these lists in action and all of these games unfold. We're going to be talking about the 4 top cut lists today, starting with 4th place. However, before we jump into that, I do want to give a quick shout out to everybody who supports TacticalTortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members you can join down below the video, as well as my subscribers over on Twitch. All you people are amazing, and I really appreciate that. If you do join my Patreon or my YouTube channel membership, you will get early access to these videos before they go live on the main channel, as well as the occasional custom video that I do for supporters only. So with that, let's dive in and talk about this 4th place list, which was Astra Militarum. Nassim Fouchain, also known as Fushini, if you are familiar with the Discord server or with the T5S2 series, where Fushini did play quite a few seasons and did extremely well. Nassim was playing Astra Militarum in a Bridgehead strike detachment. This detachment is focused on infantry and especially Militarum Tempestus units coming out of reserve. It grants every single infantry model in your army reroll hit rolls of 1. In addition, Tempestus models that come out of reserves or disembark transports also gain +1 to wound. The amount of efficiency you can get from the combination of these 2 detachment abilities is absolutely enormous. Reroll hit rolls of 1 isn't actually that useful on the current incarnation of Militarum Tempestus, since they will often be rerolling their hit rolls anyway when targeting enemies on objectives, but the downside of Militarum infantry is their relatively mediocre strength characteristic. They're able to put a ton of pretty decent value attacks into their opponent, gaining bonuses like +1 to hit and additional attacks from their orders. However, the downside is that oftentimes those are only buffing weapons like plasma guns or even just las guns. Gaining +1 to wound on Militarum Tempestus units is absolutely enormous, since it pushes those huge volume of hotshot las gun attacks or plasma gun attacks to wounding basically anything in the game on 5s or even 4s. These abilities alone are incredible for Tempestus focused armies. However, we also gain some additional synergies from their stratagems and enhancements. Nassim was running a trio of Militarum Tempestus command squads. One of them was running the Bombast Vox array, which allows it to triple its orders. Each time the officer in the unit issues an order, if the unit also includes its Master Vox, you can split the order to 3 separate units instead of only 1. As long as you have a Master Vox in that unit, you can then also be issuing those orders at up to 24 inches rather than the normal 6 from Tempesters. The interesting thing about this is that the orders must target separate units units. You can issue the order to 3 separate units, but you don't actually issue additional orders, and it all must be the same order. But what this lets you do is stack multiple orders on your other Tempestus command squads. Tempestor Primes can take a command rod, which allows them to be affected by up to 2 orders simultaneously, and given the fact that each single Tempestor Prime is going to issue an order probably to their own unit when they arrive from reserve, having a Bombast class Vox Array allows you to double up those orders on those arriving units when you doom drop a bunch of Tempestus Ions in the face of your opponent. The most common combination here is +1 ballistic skill from Take Aim and +1 attack on rapid fire weapons from first rank fire, second rank fire. A large enough Tempestus command squad will have 3 plasma guns in it, as well as a bunch of hotshot las guns and maybe even volley guns potentially. So you're able to potentially fish for a ton of additional hits or just reroll a bunch into additional hits thanks to the Tempestor's leadership ability. This Tempestor Prime was also the Warlord, which unlocks the 3rd detachment rule that Bridgehead Strike has. That's right, this detachment gets 3 separate detachment abilities. The 3rd ability is that if a Militarum Tempestus officer from your army is your Warlord, your Tempestus Scions gain Battle Line, and when they're not battle shocked, gain +1 OC. Now these 3 Tempestor Primes were followed up by 2 tank commanders as well as Ursula Creed. One downside of unlocking this Tempestor Prime Battle Line bonus is that you don't get Lord Solar Leontis in your army, which means you are a little strapped for command points. That's because the Tempestor officer has to be your Warlord in order to unlock the Battle Line and +1 OC bonus, and if you include Lord Solar Leontis, he assumes the Warlord slot automatically, so you don't get the opportunity to promote an officer to your Warlord. Ursula Creed helps assuage that, however, by giving you uses of free stratagems each turn. And you do have a lot of stratagems to be used on both you and your opponent's turns. Now, following that up, we also had a pair of tank commanders. These guys are just going to provide some armored might and backline shooting for the army. They're both equipped with Demolisher battle cannons in this list. This will prevent your opponent from moving too aggressively into you. They also just add some good old-fashioned Demolisher cannon shooting and multi-meltas to punch through high armor save or high toughness units. Given that these guys are able to order themselves and give themselves +1 to hit, they basically operate totally independently, and they don't really need much support from an army that generally only benefits other infantry squads. From there, we also have 2 units of Catachan Jungle Fighters to add some mid-board presence. These guys are able to push up the table with their scouting, complete objectives in the early game, and kill enemy screening units that are going to then prevent your Tempestus Scions from dropping in and doing all of the damage they could possibly do. We have a single standard infantry squad as well as our Tempestus Scions. That includes 4 units of 10 for those Tempestors to jump into. And the majority of them are equipped with a combination of plasma guns, melta-guns, and hotshot volley guns. We then saw 2 Taurochs in the transport slot as well as a Taurochs Prime, 3 units of mortar teams. These guys are also able to clear out enemy screening units. They are infantry units, so they gain that basic reroll ones to hit, which is something they don't usually have access to otherwise. However, if you have enough officers to order Take Aim on the units and they're able to remain stationary, they do hit on 4s, even targeting enemies that they can't see. And having long-range infantry shooting also allows you to synergize with servo designators, which, if you are firing at a target directly, not using indirect fire, you can strip cover from them and make them take even more damage from your massive drops of Tempestus Scions. This does require the heavy weapon teams to move into line of sight of enemy targets, but that is a small price to pay for the added damage that you're suddenly doing with those Tempestor bricks. We then have 2 units of Tempestus Aquilons. These guys can use aerial extraction to be placed into strategic reserve and continuously deep strike 6 inches away from their targets. They're also gaining +1 to wound when they come in using their Sentry Flamers, which is an additional nice benefit to have. And we've talked at length about how strong Tempestus Aquilons are on the channel in the past. Now, transporting these units around are 2 Taurochs. Those are likely going to at least start embarking the Catachan Jungle Fighters to give the transport scout and get more mid-board presence, potentially just offering themselves up as trading pieces or utility units to score objectives since they are only 65 points, or even potentially embarking some of the other infantry to then project them up the table in a future turn and get that +1 to wound that we get from disembarking them from a transport. We also then have a Taurochs Prime. These guys have fire support, so they're able to offer wound rerolls to stack with that +1 to wound that we're getting from the detachment ability. And we have that additional unit of 10 Tempestus Scion that we can embark into that transport to benefit from that effect. Now, on the whole, this detachment's going to be doing an absolute immense amount of damage. Once your Militarum Tempestus units set up on the battlefield, as I mentioned before, if we have line of sight to them with an infantry unit, we can ping a shot into that unit in order to use servo designators and strip cover from the target. We can then use firing hot to give the las weapons in a Tempestus Scion squad an additional strength and AP, pushing us up to AP2 and ignore cover with +1 to wound, and if we are disembarking from our Taurochs Prime, potentially even full wound rerolls as well. well, meaning something even as basic as a hotshot lasgun, if it's being ordered to first rank fire or second rank fire, at strength 4 with +1 to wound and full rerolls, meaning it's almost certainly wounding on 5s, even against a heavily armored target with a toughness of 8 or higher. At EP2, ignore cover. That's an immense amount of damage from just your basic lasguns, and you can stack that with additional damage from their special weapons. Things like 3-shot plasma guns, thanks again to that +1 attack from first rank fire, second rank fire, that then could be potentially wounding on up to 4s at AP3 ignore cover, and melta-guns, volley guns, or other heavy weapon options. We can repeatedly set up at least the strategic reserve part of this combo using aerial extraction at the end of our opponent's movement phase to remove Militarum models with deep strike from the battlefield, place them into strategic reserve, and then give us the opportunity to arrive back on the battlefield in a future turn to then gain that +1 to wound again if we are a Tempestus Scion. When they arrive back on the table, we can use Bellicosa drop to arrive 6 inches away from enemies, making it even more difficult to screen. The Tempestus Aquilon units already have this ability baked in, but those huge 15 model Tempestus Scion bricks also now gain the ability if we're using this 1 ZP strat on them. While once on the table, Militarum Tempestus are not that difficult to remove. They are fairly beefy units, just given the fact that there are 15 models in them, and that you can remove all of the las guns in the unit before you start losing heavy weapons, but you should expect to be losing models once the Tempestus Scions have committed. That said, the army is incredibly good at sandpapering out enemy utility in positions where the opponent has a difficult time responding, then using aerial extraction to pull those units back into reserve at the end of the opponent's turn. If it can spend a couple of turns sandpapering those units away, and even potentially using its Catechins or Torox Prime mounted Tempestus Scions to ensure that you can kill all of your opponent's screens, you can then drop a bunch of Tempestus Scion units onto your enemy, using your Bomb Blast class Fox Array to throw orders onto all of them, supercharge them with these stratagems, and absolutely dumpster them to the point that they can no longer deal with the 2 tank commanders sitting at the back of the table. Bridgehead Strike has come out of the gate swinging after this Grossman's drop. It has proven itself to be one of the strongest detachments in 40k and has an absolutely staggering win rate, at least at the time of recording. So it's no surprise that we saw it in the top 4 of this enormous event. And with that, we'll go ahead and move over to the 3rd place finisher, Josh Roberts, using an Ultramarine Gladius task force. Now, I hope I don't have to talk too much about how strong Ultramarines are since the December update. The army has gotten enormous buffs to characters like Robute Gilliman, who can now choose 2 of his Primarch abilities rather than simply 1. This will almost always be a free stratagem or a discounted stratagem in both his turn and his opponent's turn, as well as 2 targets for Oaths of Moment. Oaths of Moment gaining +1 to wound for Codex compliant chapters like Ultramarines means that the entirety of the Ultramarines army is hitting incredibly hard. And when you combine that with Gladius Task Force and the immense amount of flexibility that this army is able to bring, it is one of the strongest armies in the game currently. Josh Roberts chose to combine these incredible effects with an armored variety of the list. Now, one list that is very popular right now is an Ironstorm Spearhead version of Ultramarines, taking units like Ballistus Dreadnoughts and Vindicators, buffing them up with those floating rerolls from the Ironstorm Detachment ability, then also that +1 to wound and hit rerolls from Oaths of Moment. That is a huge combination, the downside being that Ironstorm Spearhead tends to lack some amount of flexibility. Once you engage it in melee, it is simply fighting you. It has very limited access to things like fall back and shoot. Only a single vehicle can be targeted with it thanks to an enhancement. And if your opponent is able to dodge your threat ranges and then punch through your armor, it has a limited capacity to hit back. So while its damage output is higher, its flexibility is lower. And at the top end of 40k, flexibility is the name of the game, because your opponent is going to know how to take advantage of any mistakes that you make, or use the game's line of sight and fight phase mechanics to restrict your capacity to alpha strike them and prevent you from dealing mat and mitigate your damage on the crackback after they've engaged you in combat. Gladius Task Force shows up literally all of these weaknesses. It gives you access to Devastator Doctrine to advance and fire your guns. It gives you access to Tactical Doctrine to fall back, shoot, and charge with anything in your army. And it gives you Adaptive Strategy in order to target that onto a unit whenever you need to. And that being said, it's not like Gladius Task Force is not actually doing that much damage. You also get access to Storm of Fire to ignore cover, an absolutely incredible ability in 40k right now, and also gain potentially +1 AP, which, especially for units like Ballistus Dreadnoughts that have a decent but not staggering armor penetration value, allows them to punch into things like other Space Marine vehicles and even fight through smoke screens and Armor of Contempt. In his list, Josh Roberts was running both Marnius Calgar and Robute Gilliman. This is basically the standard for basically all Ultramarines lists. You get a ridiculous amount of command points, which not only allows you to fuel all of the insane flexible tools tools that Gladius Task Force gives you access to, but it also allows you to redraw secondaries using new orders as often as possible. Given that Ultramarines tend to be relatively low unit count because basically they have a third of their army locked up in characters and their attached units, they oftentimes are out of position to score any secondary at any time. But having a lot of ability to redraw, in addition to still having free stratagems, stratagem discounts, as well as passive CP generation from Marneus Calgar, you have plenty of resources to work with. The army is also running a combi weapon lieutenant. This guy can shore up your damage output a little bit by choosing one objective on the battlefield to gain wound rerolls of 1 when you're targeting enemies within range of it. He's also a lone operative, so he's able to combine with Robute Gilliman, who then also gains lone operative while within 3 inches of another infantry, so you can have both of them hanging out together, both of them being lone operative. The combi weapon lieutenant, in and of himself, is also very difficult to deal with. He has a reactive move that you can also combine with the already existent reactive move inside Gladius Task Force, and then move away from enemies during their movement phase, potentially multiple times during that phase. Last and certainly not least, we also have an interesting inclusion, a captain in Gravis armor. Now, the army is not including any units that the captain in Gravis armor can attach to, but that is not too surprising. This guy has been equipped with the Artificer armor enhancement, making him one of the more difficult characters in the faction to kill. He gets his armor save improved to a 2+. You can stack that with Armor of Contempt or Cover to make him a 1 or even 0+ effective armor save. He halves incoming damage, and then any of the damage over top of that halving, he can then potentially ignore on a 5+, thanks to that Artificer armor once again. That makes this guy very, very difficult to take down, and while he is relatively expensive at 90 points, he does hit pretty hard in melee, with a Power Fist and Relic Blade attacking a total of 7 times with 2 damage attacks, so he's good at clearing out enemy utility units. He also gives you access to Rites of Battle, so he can use stratagems on himself discounted once per battle round, which then also combines with Robute Gilliman's discount once per turn and Marneus Calgar's free CP. You could potentially be using up to 30 CP worth of stratagems over the course of a game using this build of Ultramarines. 5 from the Gravis Captain's strat discounts, 10 from Gilliman's strat discounts, 5 from Marneus Calgar's CP generation, and an additional 10 from the CP that you gain at the start of player turns. This also lets you do things like place this model into strategic reserve and use rapid ingress on him for free, use adaptive strategy on him for free in turns where you don't need it somewhere else to give him the ability to advance and charge or advance and shoot, or even a 6-inch reactive move from Squad Tactics, letting you play him a little bit more aggressively. He's very difficult to kill, at least for non-anti-tank shooting, even when just standing out in the open, and then if your opponent comes in to melee him, he can reactive move away, and he acts as a pretty good utility unit and a counter to enemy utility units. He's just a nice little tech piece to include in the army to shore up the aforementioned weakness that this army tends to be relatively low on unit count. We then have the core of the army constructed out of vehicles, 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, as well as 3 Vindicators. This is stacking a ton of 2+ save units that can use the ample amount of smoke screens or Armor of Contempt that the army is able to have access to. These guys are also going to get improvements to their threat range and flexibility from the detachment, allowing them to fall back and shoot or advance up the table and shoot. Following that up, we also have a company hero unit to join Marneus Calgar into. They're going to make him even more difficult to kill than he already is, allowing Calgar to act as an additional late game counterpunch in addition to generating you a bunch of CP, and they also unlock his ability to advance, shoot, and charge innately. We have an Incursor squad to add a forward operator and improve the army's reliability by giving these vehicles +1 to hit. Despite the fact that the army only really has around 6 shooting profiles, between 2 Oaths of Moment, the reroll 1s from the Combi Weapon Lieutenant, as well as the +1 to hit on a target from the Incursor squad, and the built-in rerolls that Ballistus Dreadnoughts typically will gain against most enemies, the army is able to ensure that all of those attacks are extremely high reliability. We're protecting this brick of vehicles with an Infiltrator squad, and we also have a Calidus Assassin for some additional utility and to mess with enemy stratagems. And especially in matchups such as the mirror match, where an Ultramarine opponent is potentially dropping enormous numbers of CP on their units every turn, a CP tax effect that will make all of those stratagems increase in cost is going to cost them a ton of command points. And that can certainly change the battle in a format in which you're going to be seeing a lot of Ultramarines. Now we're going to stay with Space Marines for a little while and talk about the second place placer and one of the 2 finalists for the event, Innes Wilson, who was running Blood Angels. Now Innes's list is taking advantage of an idiosyncrasy of the December update. The +1 to wound from Oath of Moment is unlocked when your army includes no Codex non-compliant units in it, but it does not care what detachment you're playing them in. This allows you to choose a chapter keyword such as Blood Angels, for example, which is what Innes is doing in this case, and as long as you don't include any units with the explicit Blood Angels keyword, you still gain the +1 to wound when targeting your Oath of Moment. This allows you to take advantage of very powerful detachments that are outside of the normal Space Marine Codex, and while you give up other chapters units, so things like Rabuta Gilliman and Marnius Calgar, as we just discussed, are no longer able to be played, you still gain the abilities and stratagems from those detachments, as well as gaining the +1 to wound, thanks to the update to the Space Marine ability. In this case, Innis has chosen to use the Liberator Assault Group detachment. This is the classic Blood Angels detachment that grants enormous benefits of +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, in addition to other benefits from stratagems like Advance and Charge from Aggressive Onslaught, Lance from Red Rampage, and Fallback, Shoot, and or Charge from Relentless Onslaught. Innis's army included 2 captains. These guys synergize incredibly well with the detachment ability, being able to combo that additional attacks and strength with the benefits gained from their once per game Finest Hour effect. They can gain an additional 3 attacks from that Finest Hour, in addition to the +2 strength and additional attack they gain from Red Thirst, bringing their Power Fist attacks up to strength 10. One of those captains is also using Rage Fueled Warrior, which is basically an auto-include in any list using this detachment. It allows you to combo that once per game even further with a once per game use of Sustained Hits 3. If this captain targets his Oath target, he's then re-rolling all of his hit rolls, meaning any hit roll that is not a 6, he's then going to re-roll to attempt to gain a 6, and he's attacking at strength 10 with +1 to wound, meaning he's wounding basically the entire game on either 4s or 3s. The average damage from this character is astronomical. I've seen these captains do upwards of 30 damage on a fairly standard roll. We also then have a man after my own heart, a Librarian in Phobos armor. I love this little guy because he grants his units stealth and an equivalent to a lone operative effect, although it's not actually lone operative, so many things that ignore lone operative don't actually ignore this Phobos Librarian's leadership ability. This prevents enemies that are further than 12 inches away from the unit from targeting that unit, which can absolutely ruin a lot of potential opposing matchups. Like the Bridgehead strike Astra Militarum that we discussed earlier, armies that are focused on coming out of deep strike and performing ranged attacks onto your army are totally incapable of attacking this Librarian in Phobos armor unless they are already on the table somehow by using rapid ingress or coming out of a transport, for example. Because when the Phobos Librarian attaches into an infiltrator squad, the entire unit projects a 12-inch aura in which enemies cannot arrive from reserve, meaning that any unit that doesn't begin that turn on the table is not going to be within 12 inches of them, and since they are within 12 inches of them, they cannot target them with ranged attacks. Given how popular armies like Genestealer cults, Astra Militarum with that Bridgehead strike, as we mentioned earlier, or even enemy Space Marines using Inceptor squads are in the current metagame, this Librarian in Phobos armor is very expensive, but gives you a silver bullet in a lot of these matchups that your opponent has to play around or simply suffer the oppressive effect of not being able to use most of their abilities. Now, following this up, we have 2 standard Intercessor squads. These guys, now with their ability to double their bolt rifle shots when targeting a single enemy unit, give the army a little bit of pretty efficient infantry sweeping. They also have objectives secured, so if you control an objective with them at the start of the turn, they will then lock it in under your control permanently until your opponent comes to take it. The army has a moderate focus on transports, and being able to place Intercessor squads inside impulsors and force your opponent to kill the impulsor, then disembark the Intercessor squad onto an objective and lock the objective under your control to then leave the objective and go fight them somewhere else is enormously powerful when it comes to pushing primary objective wins. We also have an Assault Intercessor squad, which is likely to join in with the Rage Field Warrior captain to give him wound rerolls and fish for devastating wounds once he's used his Finest Hour. We have 2 Impulsors in the army to embark these units, alongside 3 Jump Pack Assault Intercessor squads, in addition to the mortal wounds they do when charging. We have a Desolation squad, which is a little bit of a blast from the past, but for those who have not seen these guys since basically the Space Marine Index came out, they fire a boatload of anti-infantry indirect fire attacks, in addition to 4 Super Crack rocket launcher attacks for d6 +1 damage. This unit is essentially using the army's Oaths of Moment in the turns where you don't have an evident melee target to engage, or at least one that you need Oaths of Moment to kill. Since they're gaining +1 to wound, they're wounding most enemy utility on 2s or 3s, and they're firing enough attacks with ignore cover from their targeter optics that they have a fairly reasonable chance at knocking out 5 or so enemy models. The army in told fires 5 D3 Castellan launchers with blast at strength 4, as well as a Vengor launcher from the Desolation Sergeant, who's firing D6 blast, strength 7, AP 1, 2 damage shots. All of these ignoring cover, probably rerolling their hit rolls while hitting on 4s, and also with +1 to wound. And this is able to put pressure on your opponent and inflict damage on their army even when they're not engaging with you, which allows you to clear out their screens or force them to come fight you, which is exactly where a Blood Angel's army wants to be. Following that up, we also have a ton of forward operators. This includes 2 infiltrator squads, one of which is likely going to join in with the Phobos Librarian, an Incursor squad who can potentially combo with that Desolation squad, since its super crack rocket launchers only hit on 4s. We also have a Reaver squad and a standard scout squad for some additional scouts. The army also includes 2 Vindicators who are appreciative of that Incursor buff. That also gives you the flexibility to Oath of Moment whatever you want to shoot your Finger Launcher and Desolation squad at, and then simply shoot the thing that you want to kill with your Vindicators with +1 to hit from the Incursors. Or similarly shore up your hit bonuses against the target that you want to shoot to death, while then Oath of Momenting the thing that you're going to kill in melee. And last but certainly not least, we also have a Stern Guard Veteran squad. These guys are equipped with devastating bolt rifles and a heavy bolter. They gain wound rerolls targeting their Oath of Moment target, meaning that they can chip in some mortal wounds in the shooting phase. However, they also gain a pretty big benefit in melee. Their ability procs anytime they attack the Oath of Moment target, regardless of whether they're shooting at it or punching it in melee. And since it affects all models in the unit, you can join a captain into them and also reroll his wound rolls, which gives you additional access to wound rerolls for your finest Howering and potentially rage-fueled warrioring captains, over top that of the Assault Intercessor squad that we already discussed. When combined with those of Moment, these guys are even a potentially more reliable home for that rage-fueled warrior captain, since you're likely just going to be Oath of Momenting whatever they're targeting to get them those wound rerolls, and that's going to get you your hit rerolls to fish for your sustained hits when you use that rage-fueled warrior. This army uses the incredible synergies that the core Space Marine Codex already has built within it to an absolutely phenomenal effect. Things like Stern Guard Veterans and Assault Intercessors, alongside standard Intercessor squads, Impulsors, and Captains, are classic inclusions. Vindicators and Incursors are a match made in heaven, as we discussed talking about the Ultramarines Gladius list. And the fact that this army also gets the opportunity to benefit from the incredible stratagems and abilities from the Blood Angels Liberator Assault group is just icing on the cake. Obviously, the big downside, the lack of those incredible characters that we gain out of a faction like Ultramarines. The benefit of Liberator Assault group in this case obviously outweighs that. And with that, let's move on and talk about the winner of the Nottingham 40k Supermajor, Chaos Daemons. If you'd asked me a month and a half ago whether I thought Chaos Daemons would be one of the better factions in 40k coming on top in January 2025, I would have told you that you are a silly goober. But in this case, it makes total sense because the new Chaos Demon Grotsmas detachments are absolutely incredible. Will was playing the new Slaneshi-focused detachment Legion of Excess, one of the weirdest detachments that we've seen released for 40k, but with a ridiculous level of power. So let's talk about exactly how this detachment works. First off, like Astra Militarum's Bridgehead Strike, Legion of Excess gives you access to 2 separate detachment abilities. The first one is Beguiling Aura, which allows you to fall back and charge. That is incredibly good because a lot of the detachment's abilities work on charging your opponent, and that includes the second detachment ability, Seductive Gambit. Seductive Gambit allows you to, when you end a charge move, so before you move on to the fight phase, declare that you will forego your ability to fight first. However, instead, you gain full hit and wound rerolls. Because you are not fighting first, this allows the defender to potentially attack you first. This is incredibly Slaneshi because you are trading, because you're potentially giving up your ability to Alpha Strike in exchange for a little bit of damage on yourself, but to then gain an excess of damage in return. This makes knowledge of the fight phase and navigation of the fight phase incredibly important for this detachment. You can use this effect to its greatest extent if you use clever combat movements, charge positioning, or you can create combinations of Slanesh characters to survive incoming enemy attacks or punish your opponent for attacking you. In his list, Will was taking 2 Keepers of Secrets. One of them included the False Majesty enhancement, which grants non-monster Slanesh units within 6 inches of that keeper +1 to wound. The Keepers of Secrets also come baked in with a +1 AP aura, meaning that the standard AP of this army is going to be very high, somewhere around 2 or 3 on basically every attack that's coming into them. The Keepers of Secrets are also very important for the detachment because they are very difficult units to engage into. They are permanently -1 to be hit from every attack, and also, when equipped with their Shining Aegis, which both of these were, have a 5+ Feel No Pain. Getting through 18 wounds at -1 to be hit on a 5+ feel no pain on your opponent's turn is very difficult, and means that the Keepers of Secrets will typically get access to these full rerolls from Seductive Gambit. Given that they have a bunch of mid-strength attacks and their Snapping Claw attacks are also devastating wounds, Keepers of Secrets benefit enormously from those wound rerolls. We're also then running a bunch of characters. The first one is a Transweaver. The Transweaver can grant you access to full hit and wound rerolls against a battle-shocked enemy unit chosen at the end of your movement phase. This importantly also affects your ranged attacks, so things like the psychic powers being thrown by the Keepers of Secrets can potentially also turn on here. And the army has ways to battle shock enemies out of step. This includes Overwhelming Excess, which can potentially give enemies -1 to hit. However, they must take a battle shock check, and if they fail it, they lose the ability to target. If you do end up battle shocking enemies in this way on their turn, they then remain battle shocked during your turn, and you can then gain full rerolls against them from the Transweaver. You can then use Sensory Excruciation to battle shock everything within your army's Shadow of Chaos, giving you access to kind of a limited version of the Tyrannid's Shadow in the Warp. You can also then potentially give your army access to rerolls from the Transweaver when targeting that unit if they fail in that way. Importantly, the Transweaver can also attach into a Demonette unit and grant them access to fight first, which is going to be fairly effective given how focused on the fight phase that this army is in both you and your opponent's turn. We're then also taking a bunch of independent characters. Also included is Celeste. Celeste is very commonly included just as a very solid character inside Chaos Demons. They have a high top-line profile, including a fast movement, 9 wounds, a 2+ regeneration once they're killed, and an absolute boatload of attacks. 6 strength 4 attacks, in addition to 6 strength 7 AP2 3 damage attacks, meaning that they're just a very dangerous character that is also difficult to kill. When leading unit, they also grant a kind of weird benefit to a Slaanesh Demonette's devastating wounds, but this is often rarely taken advantage of because without any buffs, it works on a fairly narrow band of opposing profiles. The next character we're including is the Mask of Slaanesh. The Mask is a fairly self-sufficient lone operative character who can also provide an enemy unit -1 to wound within 6 inches, chosen at the start of the fight phase. This is incredibly important because it allows the Mask to follow around your more powerful units and debuff enemies that would potentially be fighting first into them if you are using your Seductive Gambit to gain yourself wound rerolls. You're essentially going to charge into an enemy, choose to fight after them, and you can potentially stack -1 to hit and -1 to wound together from other effects like the Fiend Aura or the built-in defensive technology of a Keeper of Secrets to mitigate your incoming damage and then give you excessive damage coming back. The Mask also grants +1 to wound that enemy unit for Slaanesh Demons, and given that the army is almost entirely Slaanesh Demons, that's going to be super useful. Last and certainly not least, we have a Torment Bringer on Exalted Seeker Chariot. This is kind of the last piece of the puzzle because it grants access to a fight on death to your squishier units. Slaanesh Demon units from your army within 6 inches of the Torment Bringer gain a 4+ fight on death, meaning that even your squishier units can charge into an enemy, choose to Seductive Gambit, be killed, and then still fight and benefit from those wound rerolls even after your opponent has struck first. The Torment Bringer also projects a sustained hits 1 aura within 6 inches of it, which gives you further benefits from the hit rerolls from your detachment ability. Not to mention the fact that the Torment Bringer also comes with 23 attacks herself, and while they are only strength 4, 1 damage, that is excellent infantry sweeping, especially to clear screens that would potentially prevent your more powerful melee units from getting to their targets. Now, what melee units are we including, do you ask? We have a Demonette unit to potentially attach into the Transweaver. The Demonettes are gaining all the benefits of the detachment ability. They also give you a fairly low price per wound unit that you can pass wounds over onto using the Thief of Pain stratagem. This is another way that you can mitigate incoming damage from your opponent. So we have potential hit and wound modifiers, and also the ability to eject over damage to your other units if you would lose models as a result of those incoming attacks. We have a unit of Plague Bearers to lock in the backline objectives and simply act as a utility unit and screen out your backline. The army is going to play extremely aggressively since everything is fast and melee oriented, so having a fairly resilient infantry unit to sit on your backline objectives and ensure you retain control of them is very important. And then from there, we have a ton of fast melee units. This includes a total of 15 Fiends of Slaanesh and 15 Seekers of Slaanesh. Now, these Seekers are able to control the battle in the early game by alpha striking your opponent. They have a 9-inch scout move and can reroll advance and charge rolls innately, in addition to having an Instrument of Chaos for +1 to charge. So they're able to move up to potentially 23 inches at the beginning of the game between your scout move and your first movement phase, then charge with +1 into your opponent's deployment zone and lock your opponent in and stop their guns from being able to move in and attack you. They're also able to potentially clear out enemy utility units and enemies that can movement block your larger and scarier units like your Fiends and Keepers of Secrets. The Fiends are kind of the key here because that's where a lot of the damage of the army is coming from. Each Fiend comes with a staggering 5 AP2, 2 damage attacks with devastating wounds. So when they hit Seductive Gambit, they're going to be handing your opponent a ton of mortal wounds thanks to the wound rerolls from those devastating. They are beast models, so they gain the benefits of things like the False Majesty aura from the enhanced Keeper of Secrets, which will then also give them +1 to wound. So they're wounding most of the game on somewhere around 4s or 5s, probably rerolling their wound rolls and triggering some devastating damage. And if they're nearby a Keeper of Secrets, any of those non-devastating wounds are also coming in at AP3. They also project a soporific musk, meaning all enemies that are non-vehicle or titanic within 6 inches are -1 to hit and get penalties to desperate escape checks. So not only are these guys going to make your opponent take additional casualties when they are battle shocked and falling back from you, but they are also going to make themselves and other units more resilient, at least against non-vehicle enemies, when performing a Seductive Gambit and potentially taking the opponent's attacks first. However, I think it's also important to note that the number of offensive buffs that Slaanesh demons are able to combine together, including things like +1 AP and +1 to wound, make it so that these Fiends only often need to Seductive Gambit into particularly hardy enemy units. When attacking things like Space Marines or smaller units, they don't really need to take that damage first. They can just go in and roll their natural attacks and probably kill their target. However, even if they do, they are coming in at toughness 5 with a 5+ invulnerable save and 4 base wounds, so they're not even going to be taking that much damage on that Alpha Strike anyway. I think it's also important to note here exactly how the fight phase typically works with this attachment. Because you're oftentimes engaging in multiple places at once, Seductive Gambiting with multiple units from your army can kind of mitigate the effectiveness of stratagems like Counter Assault that would allow your opponent to normally interrupt the flow of combat, because they're essentially already interrupting for free. And because you're typically engaging in multiple combats at a time, your opponent is only choosing one unit to fight at a time. So it's not like all of your units will automatically fight last when using their Seductive Gambits. It simply trades activation with your opponent instead of all of your units fighting first. When combined with the incredible defensive mechanics that this detachment has, at least against melee attacks, and the ludicrous speed and Alpha Strike potential that units like Seekers of Slaanesh and Fiends have, if you're able to stage up in an aggressive position, a Legion of Excess army will simply push their opponent off of the mid-board objectives, force them into their deployment zone, and use successive waves of incredibly hard-hitting and incredibly annoying melee units to keep their opponent pinned down while they win over top. If you aren't able to answer the incredible melee survivability of the army, as well as its extreme damage output and the massive number of rerolls that it's getting very quickly, it's extremely difficult to get out over top of this variety of Chaos Demons. I should also mention as well the terrain that the event was using. The UKTC terrain pack looks fairly similar to the standard Pariah Nexus terrain pack typically used by the US Open that Games Workshop recommends. There are, I believe, some more lines of sight through the midboard, so once two armies are engaged, it is typically easier to get line of sight around terrain features in the center of the table than it is normally. However, almost all of the terrain layouts have good spaces to either hide big melee units in the early game or stage them up in the center after a turn or two of moving. And I think an army like this Legion of Excess that is able to place massive numbers of fairly high movement characteristic units that can go through walls and are very threatening in melee is perfectly situated to take advantage of this. A lot of the UKTC terrain layouts have a large L structure somewhere around the center of the table, and those are incredibly crucial for an army like this to be able to cross the middle of the table and engage the entirety of the enemy army to then beat it in melee. Given that Legion of Excess and all of the other demon detachments that just came out of the new Grotsmith drop gained access to the ability to move their larger models through ruin walls, and the fact that the majority of the army is either infantry or beast keyworded, the fact that there are these fairly defensive ruin structures around the middle of the table, I think makes an army like this incredibly solid. That's also probably a reason that we saw Blood Angels do fairly well as well, because they have a similar level of threat range to an army like this Legion of Excess. So with all that being said, huge congratulations to Will Whitaker for taking down this event, the biggest event of the season so far, and showcasing how strong Chaos Demons are looking in this new format. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about the results of the Nottingham Supermajor this weekend, and what you think about 40K with the December update so far. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.